can you hear? This is better. I'm just going to hold up my tie for the next 50 minutes. That was actually my first radio interview ever, and this is the first time I've talked to more than 7 people in my life. So bear with me. Yes, as Monica said, my name is David Perry. I am a cryptologic mathematician at the NSA. And during the summer, I teach a 3-week course in cryptology. How many of you have heard of CTY, maybe even have done CTY? Excellent. Yeah, I just finished a class a week and a half ago in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, at the Franklin and Marshall campus. And a lot of this material comes from that class. And I enjoy giving this lecture in particular because a lot of people nowadays seem to know about the Enigma machine. You've heard about it. It's been kind of popular in books and in movies in the last 10 years. The story itself has only been really known to the public for about 30 or 35 years. How many of you have heard of the Enigma before? Wow. Yeah. Have you seen this movie, Enigma, Kate Winslet? Anyone? Any other movies that involve the Enigma? Just call them out. When I ask questions, just call answers out. U-571, how many people have seen that? Matthew McConaughey? Anyone see Dude, Where's My U-Boat? It's the worst movie ever. Yeah, so the Enigma machine is kind of well known. It was a crypto device used by the Germans during World War II. But I think most people don't really know how it worked. They just know it was used for encryption. A lot of people have understood that the Germans thought it was unbreakable. And they had very good reason to believe it was unbreakable, but in fact, it really wasn't unbreakable. I guess that makes it breakable. It was first broken by the Poles in the 30s, and that's not so well known. But then it was exploited repeatedly in England at Bletchley Park, and a lot of people know more that story and Alan Turing's story than the Polish story. What I'm going to talk about in this lecture is how the Enigma actually worked, how it encrypted messages. And what I want you to understand by the end of this talk is why the machine was designed to work the way it worked. Why did they think that this was unbreakable encryption? So what we're going to do is actually go through 2,000 years of cryptologic history in a very short span of time. And I want to hit the high points and look at why the machine was designed the way it was. And you all should understand that by the end of this talk and know exactly how the Enigma worked. Okay. So first of all, not only have most of you heard of the Enigma, but I think a lot of you know something about cryptology already. Okay. This puzzle I took, this cryptogram, was taken from a Lancaster newspaper a few years ago. And it's clear what is intended. It's an encrypted message. The method of encryption is that every ciphertext letter here represents a plaintext letter consistently throughout the message. So maybe the M stands for an R. And every M in this message stands for an R in plaintext. What we have to do is try to figure out which letters represent which other letters. Usually, people in the audience can tell me at least how to start this particular puzzle. Because there's something kind of obvious, so just call it out.
You know, the very first word is like there, T-H-E-R-E.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to point vaguely and a sea of voices arises. Someone got the very first word. I think they said it was there. Okay. Certainly, there's something that stands out. There's a 3-letter block that really stands out. AVC. Okay. It appears twice as a word in this cryptogram, and it appears at the beginning of the very first word. It might not be the word there. What's another possibility? These. But certainly, THE is very common, not just as a word, but as a trigraph. So that would certainly be a good place to start. Okay. And once you guess at part of the message, you can fill in your hypothesis. You can fill in the other T's, H's, and E's, and then try to go further. Okay. And I think everyone in this room could probably solve this puzzle in less than 5 minutes. Okay. Before I reveal the answer to this puzzle, I should tell you, this is actually an example from the newspaper. These puzzles are horrible. The answer is always some kind of pun. It's some kind of horrible joke, but it's not funny. And I'm telling you with complete honesty, I did this again this year. I use these as punishment. If my students don't quiet down during study hall, they get distracted, I threaten to give them a cryptogram. And the first time they're like, ooh, puzzle, sure, we'll do that. But they're quiet the second time I threaten to give them a cryptogram. The solutions are horrible, and I do not take responsibility for it. This is the answer to the puzzle. They're just puns. They're stupid. They're not rewarding. It's like an ice cream cone without the ice cream and without the cone. It's horrible. Okay. So there is no limit to the heights every man can attain by remaining on the level. Okay. Now, I'm telling you, this technique of encryption, this letter-for-letter substitution consistently throughout the message, was actually considered to be unbreakable for over 1,000 years. Okay. If you can believe that, why is it that we can look at this puzzle and solve it in less than 5 minutes?
Practice.
Any ideas? What's one thing that's kind of obvious about this puzzle that makes it easier to solve?
Letter groupings.
What's that? Patterns. There's something even more obvious that we see that helps us. Spaces. Why on earth would we give spaces if we were actually using this technique to encrypt things? What happens if I remove the spaces? Okay. Is this now harder to crack? Is it impossible to crack? Okay, no, because you've already told me patterns. Is it not the case that you can still see AVC repeated 3 times in this short message? And might you still think that represents THE? Yes. Okay. So why exactly do we intuitively know this nowadays? This uncrackable cipher, why do we kind of understand how to crack it? Well, before I get into that, let me give the technical name for this cipher. Okay, we call this a monoalphabetic substitution cipher. There's a single ciphertext alphabet or key alphabet rule that allows you to encrypt or decrypt. Okay, and any scrambling of the alphabet would be a key you could use for encryption. Okay, there's one up there. The mathematical term for a scrambling of the alphabet is a permutation. Okay, any permutation of the alphabet gets you a key for this kind of cipher. Okay, now at the bottom I wrote down a really large number. I claim there's this many permutations of the alphabet. Okay, where does that number come from? I heard 26 factorial. Yeah, factorial, okay. 26 factorial, that is to say 26 times 25 times 24, all the way down to 1. How do you obtain that answer? Well, that would be too long perhaps for 7 of you to call out the answer. There are 26 choices for what A encrypts to, but once you know what A encrypts to, there are 25 choices for B, and so forth. Yes, the answer is 26 factorial. Okay, would you agree that's a very large number? Yeah. It's about 4 times 10 to the 26th power. Why do we care that there are this many permutations or this many keys for this cipher system? Well, because there's something a code breaker can always do. And we want to keep this in mind for the future slides. A code breaker can always try something called brute force to decrypt something. Okay, what that means is that as a code breaker, I can just try a random key. Okay, and I decrypt the message with my randomly chosen key. Oh, the first one didn't work. I'll try a second key. Okay, try that. Oh, it didn't decrypt. Try a third key. How long do you think it would take in this scenario to use brute force? Too long. Too long. Even with computers, too long. Okay, as a code maker, you want to always make sure that you guard against brute force. And the way you do that is to make sure that your system has a lot of possible keys that you and your intended recipient can share to exchange secret messages. Okay, before we go on, let me actually take a step back and talk about a very specific kind of monoalphabetic substitution cipher. I think I mentioned this on the radio program. There's something called a Caesar shift. It's a very simple monoalphabetic substitution cipher. You encrypt just by sliding every letter over a certain number of fixed spaces to the right. Okay, and there are 26 ways you can do this. Okay, and just as some notation, if we're using the method of encryption where A encrypts to D and B becomes E and C becomes F, let's refer to this as a Caesar D cipher. Okay. Now, are there really 26 different shifts of the alphabet? Or would Caesar A encryption be kind of lousy? Where A becomes A and B becomes B and C becomes C. Okay, there's really only 25, But again, why do I care about that number? Well, because how would you crack a Caesar-shifted cipher? You just try the 25 different possibilities, and you'll eventually find the correct one. Okay, and this is named the Caesar cipher after Julius Caesar, who talked about cryptology in one of his books on the Gallic Wars. I'd like to think he didn't actually use this type of cipher, that he was just talking about a kind of cipher you could use, because it is very vulnerable to brute force. Okay. Now, intuitively, even when you take out the spaces, everyone in the audience seemed to understand that you could look for patterns. You could look for bias in the ciphertext, and that would still be a way to crack this kind of encryption. Okay. That's called frequency analysis. Okay. Why is it something that we understand so readily, but took 1,000 years for the world to sort of understand that? Well, I guess if this were a smaller audience, I might solicit some actual opinions, but it's not. The reason for that is, well, how many of you play Scrabble? Okay. How many E's do you get in Scrabble? 12. And why do you get 12? Yeah. We are, in general, a very literate society. We, almost universally, we have a high literacy rate. We know that some letters are more frequent than others, that Q's and Z's and J's hardly ever come up in words. But in history, many cultures were not as literate. In fact, literacy rates were very low historically. It was the Arab culture that first had enough people who worked as secretaries transcribing things, encrypting things for their bosses. And if you're writing a lot of stuff down, if you're always using this kind of encryption, you cannot help but see bias in letters, that this letter appears the most frequently in the language. And it wasn't long after they noticed that they were able to crack these kinds of codes. Okay. Well, once you're able to crack a particular kind of code, the ball goes back into the court of the code maker. Okay. The code breakers can break something. Well, the code makers have to come up with something better. Okay. And they tried a few things like, oh, what if you misspell words? Or what if you introduce what are called null characters that don't really mean anything but throw off frequencies? This worked as spackling for a few centuries, but eventually cryptanalysts they knew all the tricks, and they were able to crack anything that the code makers tried. They really needed to have a conceptual leap forward. Okay. And the conceptual leap forward was the notion of a polyalphabetic substitution cipher. The idea that, well, maybe you don't use the same rule to encrypt every single letter, so that the bias in plain text is seen in the ciphertext. Maybe you have to use a different rule for each letter as you encrypt. And the easiest way to do this, the first way that was adopted kind of universally, was something called the Vigenère Cipher. Okay, and here's how it worked. Maybe you've already read this slide. You have to choose a keyword or phrase. You agree upon that with your intended recipient. For example, the word climb. And then you write that keyword over and over above your message until you get to the end of the message. And above every plain text letter to encrypt it, you just use that particular Caesar shift. Okay, so let's take a look at that more carefully. So if we wanted to take that awful pun sentence, there is no limit, ... and encrypt it with the keyword climb, you just keep writing the word climb above the sentence. And to encrypt the T, I use a Caesar C cipher, where A goes to C, B goes to D, and so forth, and the T encrypts to V. To encrypt the H, I use a Caesar L cipher. And if A goes to L, H will go to S, and so forth. And you ask, does this really defeat frequency analysis? And the answer is, well, sure, it looks like it, because a T can become a V, but oh, look, at the end, I see a T becomes an F. And sometimes V comes from T, but V can also be the encrypted version of N. So if I count how many V's there are in the cipher, it doesn't automatically give me something meaningful. Okay, so the Vigenère cipher is excellent, and in fact was referred to as le chiffre indéchiffrable. Anyone speak French? Pas moi. Si. Okay, so le chiffre indéchiffrable is just the cipher, the indecipherable cipher, or the uncrackable cipher. Okay. It turns out, however, and I want to cut to the chase so we can get to the Enigma, it was very chiffrable. It was not indéchiffrable. So we're already going to talk about how to crack the Vigenère. Okay. To do so, let me go back to the original sentence and now encrypt it both with the monoalph that we know we can defeat with frequency analysis and the Vigenère method of encryption, which we don't yet know how to crack. Okay. Why is monoalph bad? Well, because THE always becomes AVC. And that's bias, that's repetition I can exploit as a code breaker. But the Vigenère is great because sometimes THE becomes VSM. But oh, over here THE becomes something different. It becomes EPQ. But then down there THE becomes something different. It becomes EPQ. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. That looks like a repetition to me. I thought the Vigenère idea was going to sort of eliminate repetition or eliminate bias. Well, it looks like it doesn't eliminate repetition. It's reduced it because THE can become VSM, but it looks like it twice became the same thing. Okay, is that something we could potentially exploit? Well, let's take a much longer message. Okay, can anyone crack this? I've got all night. Okay, perhaps it's the case that looking for repetitions in the cipher might give us some information. I've actually hidden a 3-letter word. It actually comes up in this ciphertext many times. Can you find it? Use. Yes. Okay. The trigraph USE comes up 5 times in the cipher. Okay. Now that may be entirely coincidental, or it may be that USE represents the same trigraph in plain text. How do we know? Well, let me add something to the picture that might explain how to proceed. Okay. What I've done here is I've added the distances that occur between these repetitions. It takes exactly 16 characters before you go from the first instance of use to the second, then 40 characters, then 8, and then finally there's 240 letters between the 4th and 5th instances of use. Is there anything at all that might strike you? Yes? Okay, we have a hypothesis that the keyword has 4 letters in it. Okay, does anyone understand why that's a good hypothesis? Yeah, I heard someone else shout something. It could also be 8. Okay, is that what you were going to say? Sort of. Okay, yeah, it's possible that the keyword is 4 letters long or it's 8 letters long. If, in fact, these instances of ciphertext really do come from the same plaintext trigraphs, that means the keyword has to cycle a certain number of times and get back to the same key letters above these ciphertext appearances of use. And if the keyword is 8 letters long, that will give us the same key letters over these same ciphertext letters, resulting in the same plaintext letters. Okay, now if there are coincidences, that's something we can't really address right now, but if it's not a coincidence, this gives us information about the keyword. It's potentially 8 letters long. Okay, is that helpful? Does that tell us what the keyword is? Okay, how about brute force in this case? We didn't even really talk about that. Brute force in the Vigenère, that's rough because you don't even know how long the keyword is. Even now that we think we know it's 8 letters long, what about brute force? How many different keywords are 8 letters long? A lot. They don't have to be intelligible words. They could just be random letters. Okay, so brute force is still not what we want to do. What we do want to do is, I'm going to put some random symbols up to represent the 8 unknown letters that we are seeing here. Okay, why is this helpful? Well, it's helpful if we try to do a divide and conquer strategy. I want to try to get 1 letter at a time. So let's first look at the letters that are encrypted with the spider web. Okay, that is the first letter, the 9th letter, the 17th letter, every 8th letter after that. And those are the letters that I've highlighted in red. Okay, so I know that all those letters were encrypted with the same Caesar shift. Okay, how can I use that information to figure out what Caesar shift? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these red letters and I'm going to put them into a histogram. And let me show you what results. Okay, you might have noticed, I think every time I see this slide, I notice there seem to be a lot of U's, aren't there? So U seems to be a very common ciphertext letter. B also is common. there's a histogram on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, what I've done is I've taken the frequencies with which letters appear in English, like E's appear about 12% of the time, and I divided those numbers by 2 to get the same scale. The question that we have to face, or the question we're asking is, what Caesar shift gets us from this picture to that picture? Okay. Now, there's not going to be an exact answer because I have a very small sample size. So I want to use what I know about the letters of the alphabet. Can anyone think of, let's say, 3 letters in English that are very common that all appear in a row? What's that? Sorry, one over here. Sorry, 3 letters that appear that are right next to each other in the alphabet that are all common. RST. Yeah, I mean, we can see that sort of here. RST all have kind of high spikes. How about letters that aren't very frequent? There's 6 in a row that are not very frequent, and that happens right after RST. U, V, W, X, Y, Z are all uncommon letters. So this histogram, I can see 3 tall columns followed by 6 very small columns, and then there's a spike at the A, and then 4 letters after that I get the spike at E. So look at the right-hand side and try to figure out where does the RST slide to and the U, V, W, X, Y, Z slide to. How far over does it seem to be? 1? So what kind of Caesar cipher would that be? A Caesar B cipher. A slides to B, B to C. And in point of fact, you are correct. Okay. What about the 3rd letter and every 8th letter after that? So I've highlighted them in red. And now here are the 2 histograms. Okay, can we use the same kind of logic to try to figure out what Caesar shift got us from the left-hand side to the right-hand side? It's a Caesar A shift, in fact. I heard someone call it out. Okay, there's no shift at all. And I've forgotten this. I made this slide maybe 5 years ago or so. I believe the keyword I used was blankets. But the point is, it's not always easy to do this. You do have a small sample size. But if you can get a few of the key letters, then what you can do is decrypt part of the message and then try to fill in the parts you don't know and then use that to get more of the key. You can use a bootstrap method as part of the strategy. This technique was called the Babbage-Kossiski technique, and it did make le chiffre and déchiffrable. It made it déchiffrable. It cracked the Vigenère wide open. Okay. So the question I want to ask them before we get into the Enigma, which is where we're going next, clearly, what lesson do you learn from this Babbage-Kossiski, this attack? What would you recommend? What must a codemaker do with their keywords to make that attack harder? And let's just take a look at a picture like this. What can you do to the keyword that would make it much harder to do this? Yes?
Make it longer?
Yeah, the longer the keyword is, the fewer of these red letters you're going to see, and the much lousier that histogram on the right-hand side is going to be. It'll be much harder to do that attack if you use a longer keyword. In fact, could you use a keyword as long as the message itself? And then you'd have 1 red letter over there. That'd be kind of hard to do. Yeah, doesn't work. Okay, so the longer it takes for you to recycle your ciphertext alphabets, the longer it takes before your rule of encryption starts over again, as it does with the Vigenère, the better. Okay, so that's a design principle we want to sort of put into our pocket and consider when we look at the Enigma machine. Okay, so the Enigma machine, as I said, was used by the Germans in the decade before World War II and during World War II. It was actually invented in 1918 by a German inventor named Arthur Scherbius. Okay. Arthur Scherbius was just one of many people in the world who had the idea at the same time that we should try to mechanize encryption. Okay. Encrypting things by hand. You saw how long that Vigenère message was. Can you imagine if it was your task as a secretary to decrypt it, even if you had the key, 1 letter at a time, decrypting it by hand? That sounds like a fun way to spend a Sunday afternoon and a Sunday evening and then a Monday morning and then Monday afternoon. Manual encryption is tedious. It's slow. It's prone to error. So certainly everyone had the same idea about the same time. Oh, we need machines to do encryption. That would be much better. It would go faster, less tedious, less error prone. The Enigma is only one such device that was invented. Okay, now, Scherbius invented this in 1918 in Germany, and he marketed it to the German government and the German military. Okay, it was an expensive machine. Do you think he was easily able to sell the machine? No. In Germany in 1918? Why not? That's correct. Okay, what I think some of you said was a combination of the following. World War I, it just happened. Okay, Germany did not win World War I. They lost it, and they had to cede land away by treaty. They had to forcibly cut their military. It was part of the treaty. They started to suffer from hyperinflation. The economy was in the tank. Germany was not doing so well at the time. And Arthur Scherbius's Enigma machine, you know, when he explained the principles to the people he tried to sell it to, of course it was a great machine. Of course it seemed to be uncrackable encryption, but it was very expensive to produce. Okay. And not just expensive back then, but I think an Enigma machine went on eBay in May and went under just $100,000 to buy an Enigma if you want to have your own. They're kind of expensive now. They were certainly expensive back then. Okay, so they said, thanks, but no thanks, we can't really afford it. Besides, they already had crypto. I mean, the German military, they were encrypting all their messages at the time, and it must have worked out well in World War I because, of course, Germany won that war, right? No. Okay, so something happens in history that's kind of mind-boggling to consider. That something is the publication of a few books in England only about 5 years after the war. And in those books, basically, the authors discussed why England and their allies had won World War I. And they said, well, we were cracking German encryption. The ADF-GVX cipher, other methods of encryption, we could read them. This was news to Germany. It was. They were like, really? One of the authors of this, so one of those books was called The World Crisis, and the author was Winston Churchill. Okay. Why is that ironic? Well, because, Winston Churchill went on to become the prime minister and face the Germans again in World War II. Okay, so when the Germans learned that their crypto was vulnerable, they really had no position, no recourse, but to adopt something better. And they felt they could not afford the Enigma, but they couldn't afford not to adopt something, the best that they knew of, and the Enigma was that machine. Okay. The person who made that decision was a man named Rudolf Thilo Schmidt. Okay, remember that name, Rudolf Thilo Schmidt. He was the head of the German Cipher Bureau. He was not cut from the military after World War I. He rose through the ranks, and he made the decision to adopt the Enigma. Okay, Winston Churchill was then quoted as saying, "Oh, snap." Why? Because one day, or actually probably not just in one day, but over the course of several weeks, in the 20s, all encryption, all communications went dark. For France, for England, for Poland, all the countries that were intercepting messages and reading them easily, all of a sudden they could no longer read messages. The Enigma had arrived. Okay, and that was a very bad thing. Okay. I will leave that as a cliffhanger and just ignore that. Let's actually take a look at the Enigma machine. Let's talk about how the Enigma worked. Okay, so on the left-hand side, that's the Enigma machine as you would have seen it as an Enigma operator. On the right-hand side, I've taken an important portion of the machine out of the machine. Okay, let's see. There are three things that affect encryption. Okay, you see on the left-hand side, clearly you want to type stuff in. When you type in letters, it looks like there are things that are going to light up, and that's true. You have a keyboard, you have what's called a light board. But there are three components between the keyboard and light board that affect how a letter is encrypted. Okay, the front of the machine is called the plug board. You can see 26 different holes into which you can plug cables. The Enigma operators were given 6 cables initially, and every day they were told, connect this letter with your first cable, then this letter with the second cable, and so forth. Okay. The effect of having a cable between letters was that anytime you passed through the plug board in either direction, you would either swap with another letter or you wouldn't if you were unplugged. Okay, so that's the plug board. In the back, you can see what appear to be 3 rotors. That's in fact what they are. They don't just appear to be rotors, they are rotors. Here are the rotors taken out of the machine. And when the lid is closed, you can sort of tell, you can dial the rotors individually to have whatever 3 letters you want or their numerical equivalents on top of the machine. Okay. Now, these rotors were numbered 1, 2, and 3, and every Enigma operator had a machine that had a set of those. All rotors number 1 had the same wiring inside, and all rotors number 2 had the same wiring, and rotors number 3 were all the same, but each of the 3 rotors were different from the others. Okay. The rotors actually come out of that rotor assembly, and you can put them in a different order. And that was part of what you were told every day as part of the key. Put the rotors in order 2, 3, 1, or 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Okay. And then you were also told the final component of the day key is what to dial on top of the rotors at the start of every message. Okay. The third thing that affects encryption is something called the reflector. It's on the left-hand side of the 3 rotors. Okay. So far, so good. We've got a plug board, rotors, and a reflector. Okay. How does encryption work? Okay. Well, let's take a walk through the machine. Okay. When you press a key, what you're actually doing is completing a circuit. The path of the circuit is as follows. You start at the keyboard, and you come forward to the plug board. If there's a cable there, you will swap with another letter. Otherwise, you won't. Okay. From the plug board, you then go to the back of the machine to the right-hand side of the rotor assembly. Okay. Now, what the rotors were, there are 26 contact points on the left and 26 contact points on the right, and there's some permutation that takes you from left-hand side to right-hand side. That's the wiring I referred to that's on the inside. Okay, so you come to the plug board, go to the back, you enter the rightmost rotor at some point, and then you come out at some other point, entering the middle rotor, going in at some point, coming out somewhere else, entering the leftmost rotor, in, out somewhere else, and then you come to the reflector. Okay. The reflector was hardwired. It simply swapped the 26 letters in pairs. So if you enter the reflector, you will exit as some other letter. Okay. And now you get back to the rotors. Oh, this sounds like fun. Let's go through the rotors in reverse now. Coming in, going out somewhere, coming in, going out somewhere, coming in, going out somewhere. Okay. Surely that's it. No, sadly, it's not. You have to go back then to the front to the plug board. You either swap with a letter or you don't. Again, this direction. Finally, you emerge at the light board and something lights up. Okay. That's clear, right? I don't have to really explain that any further. I think it's pretty obvious how encryption works. Well, let's actually look at it a little bit more closely. Okay. Now, this schematic, where I scale down the alphabet to just have 6 letters rather than 26, I've completely stolen this idea from Simon Singh, who wrote a book called The Code Book, which I'd highly recommend you read. We use it as the textbook for the CTY cryptology class. So his idea is to, okay, let's just first look at the rotor and the reflector. Let's forget about the plug board for a second. And let's just trace through the machine. Let's talk about what happens when I press the letter A, for example. Okay, what you have to understand about the rotors is that they're 2-dimensional on this slide, but they're actually 3-dimensional in reality. If you leave the top, they sort of wrap around. Those wires that go at the top will emerge from the bottom and so forth, and vice versa. Okay, I've currently dialed AAA on top of the rotors. So who can tell me what happens when I press the letter A? Well, do I already have an answer? C. How many people think C who have traced through the path? Okay. So if you go into the first rotor, you're in that yellow path, you come to the reflector on the brown thing, you come back on the pink. Yes, the C will light up. Okay, what happens if you press a B? What will light up? F? Does anyone else concur with F? Yeah. It is in fact F. What happens when you press a C? A. Okay, did you kind of know it had to be A already? Well, why did you know that? Because if I press A and trace the path to the C, Then when I press a C, I trace the path, and it comes back out at the A. Okay, so if B becomes F, what happens when I press F? It becomes B. Why do you think the machine is designed to work that way? Decrypt. Okay, as long as the other person has their machine set up exactly the same way I do, when I encrypt the A and I get a C, they're going to press the C button and come back with the A, right? Okay, the reason why that happens is entirely due to the reflector. The reflector is what basically takes the paths from the 6 letters and it matches them up into pairs. Okay, why the reflector exists in this machine is so that decryption is exactly the same as encryption as long as the device on the other side of the communication is in exactly the same state as mine. The same rotor order, the same rotor settings on top. Okay. So there's the entire permutation that we get for this setting. Okay, let's now add the plug board. Okay, it is there on the machine. It's important. So recall that I said when you plug 2 letters together, it will swap the letters in either direction. So if you had a cable that connects the A to the D, that's represented by that like dark gray X where A goes to D or D goes to A. A second cable maybe swaps E and F. Okay, now can anyone tell me, you hit the plug board going both in and out, what happens if I press an A? I hear F, I hear E. So let's see, if we trace through the path, yeah, at the very end it's almost E, but then the cable switches the E to an F. So in point of fact, if you press A, you get F. If you press B, you get E. If you press C, you get D, and vice versa. Okay. Now, if this is all the machine did, this isn't very good cryptography, because every single time I press an E, I'm going to get a B. And so that sounds just like a monoalphabetic substitution cipher, right? The frequencies of E's in plain text will show up as B's in ciphertext. Okay, so do you think this is all the machine does? No. And the fact that we have something we call rotors means, well, clearly they rotorate. They rotate. What actually happens when you press a key is you're going to trigger that first rotor to move. Okay, so you press an A and the F lights up, and if you look at the closest rotor, it moves 1 click up, and instead of AAA on top, you now have BAA on top. Okay. Not only that, but if you notice the positions of the wirings have completely changed. This is now an entirely different permutation of the alphabet. What happens now when you press an A? And this is a little trickier because it's now not as nicely color-coded. What happens if I press an A? C? Does anyone second that? All in favor say C? C. Yes. Okay. And again, you press A and get a C. Ka-chunk. That rotor moves another time, and now CAA is on top. Okay. Now, the rotors of the Enigma machine work like an odometer of your car. You know, the odometer, every time the 0 goes to a 9 in the ones digit, it triggers the tens digit to move from a 0 to a 1. And every time the tens digit moves a certain number of times, that's what triggers the 100s digit to move. It's the same thing with the rotors. Okay, so as you type letters in merrily, each letter you type is going to move that first rotor until you get a point where you have FAA on top, and you're about to get the A on top again in the rotor number 1. And now when I press a D and get a C, the first 2 rotors are going to move F back to A, but now the second rotor has moved from A to B. Okay. How long does it take, if you understand what I'm talking about with the odometer analogy, how long does it take before you will finally see AAA on top? How many letters do I have to press?
8,000.
How many?
About 8,000. About 6 cubed.
6 cubed. How many people said 6 cubed? Yeah, 216 times. It takes 6 rotations of the first rotor to trigger the second rotor once. It'll take 36 times before you finally get AA on top of the first 2 rotors again, triggering the third rotor once, and so forth. 6 cubed, you'll finally see AAA on top, and you'll have your initial permutation again. So that's great, but the real Enigma did not have 6 letters, but rather 26. How long does it take for the real Enigma? Yes, 26 cubed, which is 17,576. Okay, that's the Vigenère idea. It takes you that long before you finally start recycling your permutation alphabets. That long before you start recycling your alphabets, there aren't going to be messages longer than 17,576 characters. Okay, this now explains why the rotors are in the machine. Okay, we understand why the reflector, so decryption works. We understand why the rotors are there, so that you take as long as possible to recycle alphabets. What do we not understand? Why is the plug board there? Okay. Well, let's see. Before we talk about the plug board, let's just remind ourselves what it means to have a setting of the machine. There are three things that I'm told every day to set up for that day. The rotor order, I take the rotors out, I put them in a particular order. I dial the same thing to be on top of the message for every, so for example, JXT. And finally, I have 6 plug board cables to use. Okay. These 3 things give me a day key. And we want to ask, as always, for any crypto system, how many keys do we actually have then? Well, how many ways can I put the 3 rotors into order? How many orderings are there of 3 rotors? 6. It's 3 factorial. How many ways can I dial a trigraph on top? So I have 26 possibilities for the first, 26 for the second, 26 for the third. How many ways can I take 6 cables and plug them into 26 openings? That's actually a non-trivial combinatorics exercise. How many of you have heard the word combinatorics before? Some of you, maybe very recently, have heard of combinatorics. It's the mathematics of counting things. And it's a non-trivial calculation. And I take great delight in making my CTY students actually do that calculation every summer. In Simon Sing's The Code Book, the magic number just appears out of nowhere, but I make the students earn it. That number turns out to be just over 100 billion. 100,391,791,500. Okay. And the total is then you have 10 quadrillion different keys. Okay. And finally, we understand why the plug board. If you did not have a plug board on the machine, if it was just the reflectors and the rotor, you would only have about 100,000 possible keys. And brute force, you could certainly use brute force then. It's the addition of the plug board and suddenly getting a factor on the order of 100 billion thrown into the mix, you suddenly have just too many keys to brute force. Okay, why did the Germans think their machine was unbreakable? It uses every design principle they knew up to that point. It certainly does seem unbreakable. Okay. But before I go on, it really would have been unbreakable if the Polish Cipher Bureau and the French and the English, if they knew nothing about the innards of the machine, they really would have been in a very bad place. How, for example, would they have known what the wirings of the rotors were? Okay, you could physically capture a machine, but in point of fact, that's not how they deduced the wirings of the rotors. What really happened is that some espionage was involved. Okay. I told you to remember a name earlier. There was someone named Rudolf Thilo Schmidt. Okay, he was the person who adopted the Enigma machine. Okay, he had a younger brother named Hans. Okay, let me tell you about Hans. All right, now Rudolf was a golden boy. He was not let go from the military because he was, a good soldier, and he worked his way up to the head of the Cipher Bureau. Hans was let go. Okay, not happy about that. He had a family to support, and in an economy of hyperinflation, he tried several things, several businesses. Nothing seemed to really work out. He eventually ended up in Berlin and had to beg his golden boy older brother Rudolf for a job at the Cipher Bureau. And even with that job, he had a hard time making ends meet. Okay, so Hans felt betrayed by his country. He had been let go from the military. He resented his older brother. He was working in the Cipher Bureau with access to lots of interesting documents and so forth. It's kind of inevitable, perhaps, what happened. Hans Thilo Schmidt turned traitor, and he sold out his country. He met with a French spy named Rex. It's hard to make up a code name like Rex, but it's true. Rex was not his real name. He met with Rex in Belgium, and he said, "I have some very interesting documents. Perhaps you'd like to photograph them and give me some money." And they offered Hans Thilo Schmidt enough money that they came to an agreement. Okay. There were two documents they photographed. One of the documents allowed the Polish Cipher Bureau to deduce the wirings of the rotors using mathematics in an extremely clever way. It was not a photograph of the wirings, but it allowed the Polish Cipher Bureau to determine the wirings. Okay, now this is kind of interesting because, wait a minute, it was a French spy who actually came across this information. Why is it the Polish Cipher Bureau that ends up utilizing the information? Well, we're all very fortunate that Poland and France had a reciprocity agreement. Okay. France and England had tried to crack the Enigma cipher. They knew roughly how it worked, but without the wirings, they really had no way to proceed. Okay. Once they had the wirings, it still is a very difficult problem. It seems intractable. It seems unbreakable. Okay. Why is it Poland that feels the motivation to crack the Enigma and not the French or the English? Okay, well, Germany was looking to the east at Poland and saying, oh, that land we gave up, we'd sort of like it back. And what's happening to the east of Poland in the 1920s? It's after the Russian Revolution, and they're looking westward trying to spread communism. Poland is feeling trapped in a vice. Poland is feeling extreme motivation. Fear is a great motivator. And they were the ones who expended the energy, and they deduced the wirings. And they not only deduced the wirings, but they figured out a way to crack the Enigma. Okay. We're not going to talk about that, but there's one final piece of information I am going to talk about. Okay, and that is what the instructions for Enigma encryption were. Okay. It turns out that this machine I've said is uncrackable. It's uncrackable in part because it uses different ciphertext alphabets to encrypt every character because the rotor keeps moving. But nonetheless, there's a vulnerability if every single message on a particular day starts out with the same setting of the machine. Because it may be you have different permutations as you go along encrypting letters, but it's the same set of permutations for every message, and frequency analysis will still apply. Because if you look at the distribution of the first ciphertext letter of every message, and 12% of the time it's R, you might say, ooh, I wonder if that's an E, and so forth. This protocol is designed to get you around that problem. Okay, what is the protocol? This is what you were told to do as an Enigma operator. So day keys were given out in monthly code books. So you look up, okay, on today, here's my day key setting. You put the rotors into the right order. You dial the right thing on top to start encrypting a message, and the plug words have to be set correctly. Okay, now for every single message, you are going to decide on a random trigraph, and that's going to be your message key. And every message you send will have a different message key. Okay, what you're told to do then is to take the message key and repeat it twice, RZU, RZU in this example. And now you encrypt, and so in the day key setting, the R encrypts to J, the first rotor goes ka-chunk, and then the Z encrypts to I, first rotor goes ka-chunk, and so forth. And for example, perhaps the ciphertext looks like JIOWQP. Now, as an Enigma operator encrypting, you take the message key you decided upon and you put that on top of the machine. Wherever the rotors ended up, forget about it. You dialed the RZU, and now you encrypt the actual message. Okay, ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. Okay, now you send the message across the wire. The other side receives it. How on earth are they going to decrypt the message when they don't know what message key you selected? Okay, how to decrypt? How does it work? Again, I guess if there were 12 people in the audience, I might solicit that from a member of the audience. But let me just tell you, it works because the other side of the communication will have the same day key to start, and they will have received the message JIOWQP. The first 6 ka-chunks of the machine will recover RZU, RZU. Now, as the decryptor, do you now know the message key? Yeah, it's RZU. You dial RZU to be on top of the machine, and now you can decrypt the rest of the message just as it was encrypted. Okay, so this protocol definitely works. Okay, why it was done, again, is that if you actually choose random trigraphs, now if I take every message and I look at the frequencies of the first ciphertext letter, 1/26th of the time it'll be A, 1/26th of the time it'll be B, and so forth, this idea of frequency analysis goes away entirely. This protocol does wonders for that. And by the time you get to the 7th letter of every message, the machines all over the field are set up differently. They're message key dependent at that point. So this protocol works wonderfully. Okay? But is there anything about this protocol that looks kind of stupid or silly that you're asked to do here? Okay, again, it starts out by saying, write down the message key twice and encrypt that. Okay, is there anything about that that seems a little bit odd? Yes? Why twice? That's the question I would ask. Repetition is bad. Bias is bad. That's what the codebreaker loves. Why on earth are they told to repeat the message key twice? Because if you think about it, this protocol would work just as well if you only encrypt the message key once. You would still, as you decrypted, expose the message key, change your machine, and decrypt the rest of the message just fine. Why in this protocol do you think are you told to encrypt the message key twice?
Make sure you get it right.
To make sure you get it right. Okay, this notion of redundancy is something we call error correction. It's the exact kind of thing that applies to your CDs. When you have CD players in cars and you drive over a bump, you don't always have the music skip on you because there's redundant information that allows the CD player to like sort of fill in the gap when you go over a bump. Okay, it's because if there's a garble at the start of the message and wireless communications with bad weather over a distance, believe me, there will be garbles in the message. If it happens at the beginning and you only have the message key there once, then you try to decrypt the rest of the message and you'll just get garbage. You'll have no idea what the message was, and you have to ask the other side to resend the message. And maybe they don't get that, so they say, oh, could you resend? Oh, could you resend? Could you resend? It's bad. But if you repeat the message key and there's a garble and you decrypt on the other side and you see RZU, RZH, you're like, okay, I don't know what the message key is because it should have been the same thing, but it's either RZU or RZH. You do not have to resend the message. It was done for practical reasons. Okay. Nonetheless, that is precisely the vulnerability of the way the Enigma machine was used, and the Polish Cipher Bureau was able to crack the Enigma. Okay. This cracking was done by a Polish mathematician named Marian Rejewski. There were some grad students who actually saw me speak earlier today, and I went through the mathematics, and we actually talked about how the Enigma was cracked using the mathematics of permutations, which you would learn in abstract algebra in college. It was stupendous because it had never been the case that mathematics was applied in this manner to crack codes. It was eye-opening. And Poland was able to actually get this information to France and Britain just before they were overrun by Germany. And France and Great Britain, they were flummoxed. They had given up on the Enigma. And they were like, are you kidding? It's crackable? Really? And the psychological effect of that was so great that even when the Germans stopped repeating the message key, a man named Alan Turing and the cryptologists at Bletchley Park were still able to come up with a way of cracking the Enigma. And they might never have even tried if it hadn't been for the Poles who had demonstrated it could be done by using mathematics. Okay. And there are a lot of stories one can tell about the Enigma, but I'm out of time. So I'll stop here. I guess there's going to be time for a Q&A. The question is, how long would it take to crack a message with a supercomputer? And I believe probably the question means by brute force. Yeah, and I honestly don't know that. I'm not a big computer junkie. I don't know what the fastest processor currently is, the best supercomputer. So the Roadrunner, I honestly don't know how long it would take to brute force. But interesting problems arise. For example, how does a computer know when it's found the right answer? Like, how do you automate that? We recognize, when something makes sense. Oh, it must be decrypted because there is no limit, blah, blah, blah. Do you have an answer to the question up there? Okay. Yeah, so the answer is, I don't know. Yes, another question?
How many working enigmas are still known to be around today, and have you ever played with one?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because the answer is yes. They actually have a few at work. They're kind of cool to be able to play with. But the American public can play with an Enigma machine that's always functioning. There's a National Cryptologic Museum that's just outside of the NSA, just outside of Fort Meade, Maryland. And they keep an Enigma machine always working. They replace the light bulbs religiously, and the museum is free of charge. I would highly recommend, if you ever get to DC or Baltimore in that area, this is a really cool museum, and it's free, unlike the Spy Museum in DC, which is like $20. I've never been to. It might be a good museum, but it's expensive. Yes?
What cracks the
Okay, so the real story is a lot more complex. There was the initial Enigma and the initial use of the Enigma, but what happened was kind of unfortunate. Germany introduced a rotor number 4 and a rotor number 5 sometime in the 30s, and everything that the Polish had done to crack the Enigma suddenly became impossible or much harder, and they were no longer able to read messages daily. And in fact, didn't know what rotor 4 and what rotor 5 looked like initially. And it was things that happened like that, like periodically the Navy went from a 3-rotor Enigma to a 4-rotor Enigma. Not because they thought the Enigma had been broken, which apparently the Germans never knew the Enigma had been broken during the war. They just added security just kind of as, well, we may as well, because who knows what they're doing. And every time they made a change to the machine, like usually something would have to be captured for us to understand what the wirings were now, and things like that. Yes. Let's see, you with the black shirt. Or dark blue.
What if they captured the book? Wouldn't it has a whole month's setup in it? Couldn't they just get it instantly?
Yeah. So the monthly code books were usually the ones that were carried by the U-boats. They had a special ink that was like water soluble, and U-boat operators were instructed, take the rotors and throw them into the water so they sink to the bottom, and take the code books and make sure they're wet so that they go away. But of course, when a U-boat is sinking, you're going to forget what your instructions are. So occasionally code books were captured before they were the ink dissolved. And sometimes code books were obtained by espionage. Hans Thilo Schmidt provided a few code books to Rex for some money. Let's see, other questions? You with the 5 fingers.
What's the best way to prepare for a career at the NSA?
Wow. Well, I mean, there are a lot of different career fields like mathematician, engineer, computer scientist, linguist. As a mathematician, they actually hire at all degree levels. They tend to say you don't have to specialize in one particular area of mathematics, but it is helpful to have some background in number theory. It's helpful to have abstract algebra. It's helpful if you know some computer science and if you can program. Certainly it makes your application stronger. But really a lot of different mathematics, different kinds of mathematics are used. Statistics, abstract algebra, it's hard to go wrong. But yeah, we could talk more specifically if you had a more specific question, like I am a math person, what do I need to do? Something like that. You with the 5 fingers behind the other guy who had 5 fingers.
What about the enigmas of the other branches of the military other than the Wehrmacht?
Yes, other branches of the military usually had enigmas that were different. They had some rotors in common so that different branches of the military could communicate, but the naval Enigma, for example, was different and eventually had 4 rotors. I think I've seen an Air Force Enigma that had 7 rotors. Sometimes these were vulnerable, and sometimes they couldn't really crack. They couldn't crack every message they came across. But yeah, that was a problem. There's not just one Enigma. There's lots. Yes.
Story about bombing Coventry true?
What is that story?
That the British allowed Coventry to be bombed without evacuating it, so as not to tell the Germans they had cracked it.
I don't know offhand. I do know there are certainly. So he's referring to the Battle of Coventry. Okay, it should be clear from the story of World War I. When you are able to break a crypto system, you really do not want to advertise that fact, even if the war is over. Certainly not during the war. Now, if you're intercepting Enigma messages and you always know where their planes are going to be, do you always want to go after their planes, precisely where they're going? Because, well, no, you don't. Germany is eventually going to say, wait a minute, how do they always know where our tanks are? What could it be? What could it be? Oh, maybe they cracked the Enigma. And they're going to adopt something stronger. Okay, so I mean, it's a very interesting thing to ponder. I mean, it's not an easy question to answer. What do you do then? You can't always know exactly what's going to happen, or seem to know, or the adversary is going to get information and change things. There were actually a lot of different tactics that were interesting, like, so I don't know specifically about that particular story, but I know we did clever things like we would send out patrol jets and accidentally spot, something that we weren't supposed to know about. Then the patrol jets would go back, and then the real jets would come. And Germany, honestly, in many cases, thought we have the worst luck ever. those dang patrol jets, they were there again. And yeah, I mean, we know now that Germany never found out that the Enigma was cracked. Like all our techniques of deception were effective, amazingly. Yes. I'm sorry?
Tell me a little bit about cryptology today, what it's like.
Cryptology today. Well, it's no longer machine-based. It's computer-based. It's digital, and because it's digital, it tends to be mathematical. I really don't want to get into too many specifics because it's too broad of a subject. Were you here for Cosmos or a similar program? Okay. So a lot of mathematics now, number theory, goes into cryptology. The RSA crypto you've probably heard of, Diffie-Hellman key exchange. It's all different. It would take too long for me to talk about, but do the research. Go to Wikipedia, read about... What's that?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I'm going to borrow his tie. The math cluster for Cosmos has a great demonstration with 4 laptops when you go outside, and they'll demonstrate to you some principles of cryptography and code breaking.
Okay. Yes, you with the green shirt. Okay, I think the question was, how did you come up with 100,391,791,500? Okay, so the problem is you have 26 holes and you have 6 cables. There's more than one way to do the problem. You can start by saying, first of all, how many ways are there to select 12 holes with which I'm going to plug from the 26? So 26 choose 12. Have you had combinatorics? Yeah. Okay, so 26 choose 12 is the start. Now that you have the 12 holes you're going to pair off, you have to select the first pair. So that's 12 choose 2. And then times 10 choose 2. Then times 8 choose 2. All the way down to 2 choose 2. Then you're almost done. You're not done because the order in which you select the pairs doesn't matter. So if you do AB first and then CD, it's still the same still the same set of pairs if you do CD first and then AB. So you have to divide by 6 factorial because the 6 pairs can come in any order. And that will give you the 100 million result. Sorry for the rest of you if that... Whoa, what? Huh? Good grief. Yes, you. I'm sorry? The same techniques, modern day techniques, or? I mean, that's a great question, actually. I would love to know more about how, they encrypted things in ancient China or Middle Age China or Japan, where character sets are much broader. I really don't know. And so the question is, I don't even know how to encrypt, let alone how to try to crack such systems. But I'm sure the systems existed because we've always wanted secrecy. Every culture. Yes, same guy with the same hand, still 5 fingers. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
What did Japan use?
Japan had their own set of codes. Some of them were called, their code names Red and Purple. They had an Enigma machine so that they could talk to the Germans. We actually had a lot of success against the Purple machine. In fact, this is one of the cool things about the National Cryptologic Museum. I believe we were intercepting Purple messages from Japan, and we figured out how the machine must have worked and built a replica of the machine, and it turned out to look remarkably similar to an actual Purple machine once the war had ended and we found that out. So I think the Purple machine replica is in the museum to see. Yes?
Another language question. Is it a lot harder to decrypt messages in obscure languages like Navajo or Wolof or something?
I would imagine so if the techniques are more like manual or machine encryption. Nowadays, with everything digital, it doesn't matter if it's Mandarin or Navajo or whatever. Everything goes to zeros and ones, and then the encryption happens after that point. So it's kind of nowadays, digital encryption is a bit equalizing in terms of languages. Did you have a?
I was going to say that maybe we should do one more question, and then Dr. Perry will be around to talk to people, but then move out. There's refreshments and the puzzles and games that we want to go to.
Yeah. Well, why don't I take 0 more questions from the audience? But if you want to